The cowboy had ridden through blizzards, survived gunfights, and buried every dream he ever dared to have. Yet the words that changed his life forever were not spoken in a courtroom, on a battlefield, or at the end of a revolver. They were spoken by a lonely widow standing on a creaking porch at sunset. "Have you eaten?" He thought it was a simple question. He was wrong. That question would lead him to a home he never expected, a love he never searched for, and a decision that would change two broken lives forever. But before we begin, if you enjoy emotional Wild West stories filled with heart, courage, and unforgettable characters, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. The wind carried dust across the plains as Colt Harper guided his weary horse along a lonely trail. The late afternoon sun hung low over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Colt had spent most of his life moving from one place to another. He never stayed long enough to call any town home. Home had become a dangerous word. Years earlier, he had dreamed of building a ranch and raising a family. Then sickness had taken his parents. A cattle dispute had taken his land, and a robbery gone wrong had taken his younger brother. Since then, Colt had stopped believing in futures. He lived one day at a time. That evening, dark clouds gathered in the distance. A storm was moving across the prairie faster than expected. Colt spotted a small farmhouse sitting alone near a field of wheat. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Light glowed warmly through the windows. His horse was exhausted. So was he. He rode toward the house, hoping to ask for water and directions before finding a place to camp. As he approached, the front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch. She looked to be in her early 30s. Her brown hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet. Her dress was plain and practical. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, yet something about her eyes made Colt pause. They carried a quiet sadness, the kind that only comes from surviving too much. The woman studied him carefully. Most strangers were greeted with suspicion in these parts. Instead, she asked softly, "Have you eaten?" Colt blinked. Of all the questions he expected, that wasn't one of them. "No," he admitted. "Then come inside." He hesitated. "You don't even know who I am." The woman offered a small smile. "You look hungry." "That's enough for me." For reasons he couldn't explain, Colt followed her. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of fresh bread and vegetable stew. The warmth struck him immediately, not just from the fire, from the feeling of the place itself. A little girl sat at the table drawing pictures with a charcoal pencil. She couldn't have been older than 8. When she noticed Colt, she smiled shyly. "Hello. Hello yourself," Colt replied. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Whitmore. The girl was her daughter, Emma. As they ate supper together, Colt learned that Sarah had been widowed nearly 3 years earlier. Her husband had died after a wagon accident. Since then, she had managed the farm alone. It wasn't easy. Neighbors occasionally helped, but most days she carried the burden herself. Colt found himself admiring her strength, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that wakes up every morning and keeps going even when life offers no reason to smile. After supper, thunder rolled across the prairie. Rain began hammering against the windows. "You won't make it to town tonight," Sarah said. Colt nodded. "I figured as much. You can sleep in the barn." He started to thank her. Then Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mum." "Yes." "The barn roof leaks," Sarah sighed. Emma was right. The little girl looked at Colt. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Why doesn't he stay here?" Silence filled the room. Sarah looked embarrassed. Colt looked uncomfortable. But outside, the storm raged harder. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Only if you're comfortable with that." Colt glanced around the room. At the fire, at the warm meal, at the little girl trying not to yawn, and at the widow whose kindness felt almost unfamiliar. "Just for one night," he said. Sarah smiled. "Just for one night." And neither of them knew those 4 words would become the biggest lie either had ever told. Because by the time the sun rose over the prairie again, fate had already begun weaving their lives together, and neither one would ever be the same again. Colt intended to leave the next morning. That had been the plan. He woke before sunrise, saddled his horse, and prepared to continue down the road. But when he stepped outside, he noticed Sarah struggling to repair a broken fence while strong winds pushed against her. Several cattle had wandered through a damaged section during the night. Without thinking, he walked over. "Need a hand?" Sarah looked surprised. "I thought you were leaving." "I was." The answer sounded weak even to him. For the next hour they worked side by side. They replaced posts, stretched wire, and secured the fence before the cattle could escape farther into the prairie. When they finished, Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead. "You didn't have to do that." "Maybe not," she smiled. "Thank you anyway." Colt mounted his horse once more. Then Emma came running from the house. "Wait," he stopped. The little girl held a wrapped piece of bread. For the road, Colt accepted it. Something tightened inside his chest. Nobody had packed food for him in years. Nobody had cared whether he ate tomorrow. He looked from Emma to Sarah, then back toward the endless prairie stretching before him. For the first time in a long while, the road didn't seem quite so inviting. "I suppose I could stay another day," he said. Emma cheered, Sarah laughed. And just like that, another day became 2. 2 became 4. 4 became a week. Soon Colt found himself helping around the farm as though he belonged there. He repaired the barn doors. He fixed wagon wheels. He cleared rocks from the fields. Every evening they shared supper together. Every evening he found another reason not to leave. Emma quickly attached herself to him. She followed him everywhere. When he repaired fences, she carried nails. When he worked in the fields, she carried water. When he sat on the porch, she sat beside him. One afternoon she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Did you ever have children?" Colt froze. "No." "Did you want any?" The answer took longer. "Once." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I think you'd make a good father." The words hit harder than any punch he'd ever taken. That night he sat alone on the porch, staring into the darkness. Sarah eventually joined him. Neither spoke for several minutes. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a sky filled with stars. Finally Sarah broke the silence. "She likes having you here." Colt smiled faintly. "I like having her around too." Sarah looked down. She hasn't laughed this much since her father died. The admission carried both gratitude and pain. Colt understood. Loss recognized loss. He had spent years carrying his grief like a stone tied around his neck. Now he saw the same burden in Sarah. Different story, same weight. Over the following weeks, their friendship deepened. Neither rushed it. Neither even spoke about it. Yet the connection grew stronger every day. Sometimes they talked while working. Sometimes they sat quietly watching sunsets. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could. One evening Sarah showed him an old photograph of her husband. "He was a good man," she said softly. Colt studied the picture. "I can tell. I still miss him." "You always will." Sarah looked surprised. Most people tried convincing widows to move on. Colt didn't. He understood that love didn't disappear simply because someone was gone. "You don't stop loving people," he continued quietly. "You just learn how to carry their memory." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. For a moment neither looked away. Something changed between them then. Something deeper than friendship. Something neither was ready to name. A few days later trouble arrived. 3 riders appeared at the farm. They were led by a wealthy rancher named Wallace Briggs. Colt recognized the type immediately. A man who believed money gave him ownership over everything around him, including people. Briggs informed Sarah that he intended to purchase her land. "It's not for sale," she replied firmly. The rancher smiled coldly. "It will be." After the riders left, Sarah looked shaken. The bank already wants payment on an old loan. Colt frowned. "And if I can't pay soon, they could take everything." For the first time since arriving, fear entered the farmhouse. Not fear of loneliness. Fear of losing the only home Sarah and Emma had left. That night Colt couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch watching the moonlight spill across the fields. For weeks he had told himself he was only passing through. For weeks he had pretended none of this belonged to him. But as he stared at the farmhouse, he finally admitted the truth. If Briggs threatened Sarah, if Briggs threatened Emma, then he wasn't dealing with strangers anymore. He was protecting family. And for the first time in years, Colt realized he wasn't afraid of staying. He was afraid of leaving. What he didn't know was that the greatest challenge was still coming. And before it ended, he would have to choose between the life he always knew and the home he never expected to find. After the story ends, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt Wild West stories full of courage, hope, and unforgettable endings. The pressure from Wallace Briggs grew stronger with each passing week. He spread rumors around town, hoping to force Sarah into selling her farm. The bank demanded payment, and neighbors quietly wondered how long the widow could hold on. But Sarah refused to surrender, and Colt refused to leave. Together they worked harder than ever. They repaired equipment, harvested crops, and sold everything they could. Still, it wasn't enough. Then one morning, Briggs arrived with a legal notice. Sarah's hands trembled as she read it. If the debt wasn't paid within 30 days, the farm would be seized. After Briggs rode away, Emma began to cry. "Are we going to lose our home?" Sarah tried to answer, but no words came. Before she could speak, Colt knelt beside Emma. "Nung." The little girl looked up. "No," she whispered. "No," Colt repeated. "Not while I'm here." For the next month, Colt worked from sunrise until long after dark. He took temporary ranch jobs, broke horses, repaired fences for neighboring farms, and earned every dollar he could. Slowly the money grew. Finally, on the last day before the deadline, Sarah walked into the bank and paid the debt. The farm was theirs. When they returned home, Emma ran through the fields, laughing. Sarah stood quietly on the porch. Tears filled her eyes. "You saved us." Colt shook his head. "No, we saved it together." For a long moment they simply looked at one another. Then Sarah smiled softly, the same gentle smile that had greeted a hungry stranger months ago. "Have you eaten?" she asked. Colt laughed. The question brought back the day everything began. "No," he admitted. "Then come inside." As they sat around the supper table, Colt realized something. This wasn't a place he visited anymore. It was home. After dinner, Emma suddenly grinned. "So are you leaving tomorrow?" The room became silent. Colt looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Colt. Then he smiled. "No." Emma jumped from her chair cheering. Sarah's eyes shimmered with tears. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Colt reached for her hand. "For years I searched for a place to belong." He glanced around the room. At the warm fire. At Emma's smile. At the woman whose kindness had changed his life. "I found it." A month later, the farm flourished once again. Lotta returned to the house. The lonely widow wasn't lonely anymore. The wandering cowboy stopped wandering. And all because one evening, a kind woman looked at a tired stranger and asked a simple question. "Have you eaten?" Neither of them knew it then. But that question wasn't about food. It was about compassion. It was about home. And it was the beginning of a love story neither of them ever expected. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional Wild West stories that warm the heart and stay with you long after the ending.